A fifth law, and to get back to the erroneous assertion that naturalism can't explain consciousness, is that it can. It's called natural selection. At the risk of boring you through repetition, natural selection is the process whereby organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. To state it very, very simply, the nervous system evolved to orchestrate movement. Feelings evolved to move organisms towards or away from stimulus. Awareness evolved to make sense of these feelings, and consciousness evolved to allow organisms to respond more efficiently to their feelings.
Okay.
And finally,
okay, you can stop it. Okay, so there's a big. Okay, this is where like he completely like messes up. So natural selection does not tell you. Okay, like I said earlier, I mean, I mentioned the first point about how science doesn't actually tell you the ontological nature of matter, right? So that's the first error. The second error is probably more serious. So this is a quote from David Chalmers. So the process of natural selection cannot distinguish between me and my zombie twin. Evolution selects properties according to their functional role, and my zombie twin performs all of the functions that I perform just as well as I do. In particular, he leaves around just as many copies of his genes. It follows that the evolution alone cannot explain why conscious creatures rather than zombies evolved. The real problem with consciousness is to explain the principles of virtue which consciousness arises from physical systems. Presumably, these principles, whether they are conceptual truths, metaphysical necessities, or natural laws, are constant over space-time. If a physical replica of me had popped into existence 1 billion years ago, it would have been just as conscious as I am. The connecting principles themselves are therefore independent of the evolutionary process. While evolution can be very useful in explaining why particular physical systems have evolved, it is irrelevant to the explanation of the bridging principles of virtue of which some of these systems are conscious. So that's from David Chalmers, The Conscious Mind. So I just want to point out here that given our definition of consciousness, so given that consciousness is mental activity in and of itself, that's not going to tell you how mental activity in and of itself came from something that is not itself mental activity in and of itself, right? Like, for example, a panpsychist, they could just say, well, consciousness is irreducible. It's always been there, right? And let's say that you're a sort of like, let's say if you're a bottom-up panpsychist, right? Well, you could say, well, everything in the universe is conscious in some sense. And then you get creatures that can have like this metacognitive awareness of their own consciousness, and that's an important distinction I want to make here. So that's the third criticism, is that he doesn't really understand the distinction between consciousness and metacognition, right? So I guess I should sort of clarify what those two terms mean. So metacognition is the ability to know about one's experiences, right? It is the ability to think about one's own thinking. But experience, right, is not identical to metacognition. You could have experiences even if you're not like self-aware of those experiences, right? As an example, you're breathing right now, right? Now you're metacognitively aware of your breathing, but it's not like you didn't have experience of breathing, right? Just because you're not metacognitively aware of it. And this is related to the two main systems in the brain that are related to awareness. And I'm going to actually get into this in my next video, but basically the idea is that the brain has many functions, but the two important ones for metacognition involve the default mode network and the dorsal attention network. So the default mode network is responsible for introspection as well as being aware of our own experiences, like our own inner thoughts and stuff. And then the dorsal attention network is responsible for us being aware of our external environments. And so what these two systems, what they explain is our knowledge of consciousness. It's our knowledge of experience, or what I term self-reflexive consciousness. But we are able to gain knowledge of our experiences through these processes, but it doesn't actually explain why we even have those experiences in the first place. Because the question is, why do we have these experiences, right? That's not something that you're not going to be able to answer from a pure neurobiological perspective, right? Because any brains, like if you say there's this one brain system or systems of brain systems that explain consciousness, well, then we need to ask, why are those brain systems conscious? what's the relevant difference between that system and anything else in the universe? You're not going to be able to give an answer to that question, right? So that's another, I guess, big error I want to point out here is, yes, evolution can explain our awareness of experience, right? But it's not going to be able to explain the experience itself, right? It's not going to be able to give you a physicalist model of how experience emerges or something like that, right? So but what I'm basically saying is evolution is totally consistent with the idea that consciousness is irreducible, that consciousness is the base of reality. So if you're an idealist like myself, what you could say, and this is sort of my view, this is also Bernardo Kastrup's view, that you have this one universal mind, and then through the process of dissociation, you have these conscious creatures, and through evolution and natural selection, then they're able to, gain knowledge of their own experiences. They're able to have metacognitive awareness of their own experiences. If you're a panpsychist or cosmopsychist, you can sort of give a similar answer where consciousness is just irreducible. It's the ground, not the ground, but like all matter has consciousness, right? And then through the evolutionary process, then the consciousness can then know about its own experiences, right? So that's how evolution plays the role. So evolution explains how we know consciousness, how we know experience. But what it does not explain, it's not going to tell you why there's experience in the first place, right? That's a totally separate thing, right? And that's why David Chalmers, that's why he points out, like, evolution by natural selection is not going to be able to distinguish between a conscious creature and a zombie, because they're only talking about the functional, roles, right? They're not actually talking about the consciousness itself, right? So I just want to point that out to, the audience, right? That I do think that evolution can explain how we gain knowledge of our consciousness, but it's not going to be able to explain consciousness itself, right? So
I think that's good. And like the Chalmers quote that you gave in the beginning, where Chalmers talks about, well, couldn't have I just have evolved as like a philosophical zombie that can do all the things that like eat, sleep, drink, reproduce, can do all those things, but then isn't conscious? Like it seems like obviously yes. It seems like Chalmers does a good job. They're talking about how like consciousness isn't necessary. Like it's not a part of like you say like we have a mouth to eat. It doesn't seem like the same kind of like necessary thing as part of like our evolutionary history for us to. Like,
I think that's the probably the biggest error or this his Rationality Rules is explanation of consciousness. It's like I can grant like all these points right here. I can grant that the nervous system evolved orchestrated movement. I can say that awareness gave us the ability. But that's not going to tell you why consciousness evolved. Like that last part about consciousness evolved. Well, no, that's ridiculous. I mean, I agree that consciousness can change, right? Like you could sort of mold consciousness. And I think that's basically my view, where I think that consciousness is irreducible, but then evolution sort of allowed us to, know about our own consciousness, essentially. But consciousness itself is still why there is consciousness in the first place. That's not something that evolution is going to be able to tell you, right? And so that's the issue that I see.
It's like something else I was just thinking about is like one of the things with consciousness is like you can't divide your experience in half. Like I can't divide your consciousness in half, Kyle. So, but then like with like evolution, like, well, you can say like there's an evolutionary explanation for like why do things just grow taller or something like that. But like it's just not the same thing. Like he's confusing categories.